the partnership with Databricks as we think about how to make them successful, not just with the technical platform, but how do we also make sure that we're investing in the other things that we know that they need to be successful, like people, process.
It's not just about like, hey, give me my data and let me go with it. It's like, how can different people and teams work together to that common goal?
Where I see organizations continue to struggle is not the expectations that they will have data available at their fingertip. It's the, how do we change our way of doing business as a result of that insight?
The way I have seen AI work effectively is to certainly be fast on experimentation, try things.
You will never have your entire data platform. You will never have all of the data across your organization in a clean, pristine state. So I think if you are sitting back to wait, I think you will wait forever.
Hey everyone, this is Saket, and thanks for listening to another episode of Data Innovators and Builders. Today, I'm speaking with Robin Sutara, Field CDO at Databricks. Robin, thank you for chatting with us.
Yes, no, thank you, Saket. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Robin, you have an incredible background. I would love for you to share a little bit of that with our audience.
Yeah, so I'm really old. Hopefully it's not too long. But so as you mentioned, I'm Field CDO at Databricks. I have been with the company for about a little more than 3 years. Essentially what that means is that I get the opportunity to help some amazing customers as they think about how to be successful with their data and AI strategies. Hopefully using the Databricks platform in some capacity, but really, how do you think about it beyond the technology? So what I do is come in and support the partnership with Databricks as we think about how to make them successful, not just with the technical platform, but how do we also make sure that we're investing in the other things that we know that they need to be successful, like people, process, operating models, change management, organizational design, sort of how do we help them drive that data and AI culture that they're looking to accomplish as they think about innovation. Prior to Databricks, I spent 23 years with Microsoft, where I did similar sort of work on helping Microsoft go through their digital and data transformation when Satya Nadella came in as CEO. And I had the opportunity to do that in multiple roles, including Chief Data Officer of Microsoft UK, Chief Operating Officer of Azure Data Engineering, as well as managing a team of data analysts. So I've sort of been at it from the ground level all the way up to, through execution to strategy. I originally started my career at Microsoft in the late 90s, supporting IE5 on Windows 3.1. So I did spend much of my career flipping between business and technology. And then prior to Microsoft, actually, I was in the U.S. Army, where I did weapons and electrical systems on the Apache helicopters in Korea on the DMZ. So I love to tell people that my career has now come full circle from Apache to Apache.
Oh, yeah. Very well said. Very well said. What an incredible background, Robin. So why don't we start with the topic of bringing AI to production? And you talked about big rocks in that topic. Let's get right into that.
Yeah. So right now, really, again, like I mentioned, I spend most of my time on the road with organizations trying to figure out how they're going to execute against this. I think right now is a fascinating time in that the last couple of years has really been a revolution in how organizations are thinking about not just AI, that's what we talk about a lot, but they're also going back to the fundamentals and foundations on how do they make sure that they have a good, strong data strategy in place as they think about executing against AI. I think we all know that you need good data to have good AI. And so for many organizations, they are thinking about, do we have the fundamentals in place to be able to actually use AI in production at scale? And what that means is, do we have data quality? Do we have good governance in place? Do we have agreement across the organization on the operating model of where data ownership and stewardship ends versus where the technology and tools are going to be able to support it? How do you balance sort of the risk versus innovation? Everybody was super excited, I think 2 years ago when ChatGPT came out on, oh my gosh, the pace of innovation is now going to be, beyond reproach. For most organizations, there was almost this step back of how do we make sure that we're minimizing the risk that represent for our organization. And so I think for most organizations that I work with, they are still looking at how do we break down the data silos? How do we make sure we have good data quality? How do we make sure that we're getting alignment on the governance and the fundamental foundations that we need in place? Now, that isn't to be said that organizations are not doing AI, right? They absolutely are. I'm seeing lots of them are sort of tackling what are some of the where we have the fundamentals and the foundations ready and the data is ready for us to be able to drive AI. What are now the business value outcomes that we can drive for the data that's already in the process while we continue to modernize the rest of the estate? Because I don't know that I have any organization that would say we're completely done with all of our data modernization. Like we have it all in great shape. We'll never ingest any new data. It's all goodness. And so I see lots of organizations balancing that. How do we modernize? And then how do we drive impact today for the business and for the organization? And what are the right use cases where we have the data ready to be able to do that?
Yeah.
And I think the other component that I talk to lots of organizations about is the people part, right? I think we talk about technology a lot, but how do we make sure that we're thinking about the impact of the technology on the people, on the workforce, or our customers, et cetera? And so what I end up talking to many, many organizations about is what does it mean to have an AI enabled workforce? How do you think about that for your organization? Right. So how do you think about what it means to have an AI enabled executive versus what it means to have an AI enabled data scientist versus a plant floor worker at a car manufacturer? And so all of those are different personas. All of them have different capabilities and competencies. And what we expect from them when we think about AI enablement and what it can do for each of those personas and roles is very, very different. And so I see lots of organizations moving away from, data and AI literacy that's very broad in scope, trying to capture their entire workforce and really starting to think about persona-based readiness and enablement. And how do we make sure that we're helping those within the organization translate what is the technical capabilities mean when it comes to your job, to the processes that you do, to the functions that you serve, so that we can make sure that we're enabling you and not replacing you.
Yeah. And you work with some of the largest organizations out there, right? And I think one thing I've heard from you is that while there is a myth and some studies saying, hey, AI is still in prototypes, you have actually seen people take AI into production and actually solve some real problems with that. And maybe let's talk a little bit about that. What's that sort of real state? There are clearly challenges, data, people, but let's start with the positives and the successes.
Yeah, I mean, I think for lots of organizations, while we love to talk about generative AI, I think for lots of organizations, what they did was actually used it as an opportunity to focus some of the efforts and activities around traditional AI and machine learning models. So if you think about particularly in the manufacturing space or right somewhere where you really could use deterministic models where you didn't have the concern, the inaccuracies around sort of the AI that you were rolling out into execution. We see phenomenal successes. If any of your listeners want to check out the Databricks/customer
Okay.
website, there's lots and lots of examples that we can share in manufacturing and financial services, in retail, healthcare. We just have some great customer examples of where they are actually in production using AI. I think one of the big ones maybe that I would refer to would be like JetBlue Airlines, for example. Because what I think is interesting about that use case is that they used the generative AI sort of revolution or evolution, however you want to refer to it, to not only do traditional AI and machine learning, but they were also thinking about what is generative AI? What do agentic systems mean as we think about how we could actually innovate in an industry like the airlines, which has been relatively stagnant for so long. I think they have done a phenomenal job of thinking about how do we do things like aggregation of data sets like weather, aircraft maintenance, staffing, customer data, et cetera, to be able to do things like if a flight gets canceled, for as all of us are sitting in the U.S. watching flights get canceled as a result of air traffic controllers, right? They were thinking about how do we use agentic systems to automatically rebook customers so they don't have to sit on hold or stand in line at the airport. to get rebooked, that we could literally, based on all of the things we know on where our aircraft are, which ones are down for maintenance, where we actually have pilots and stewards that could actually staff the aircraft, where can we redirect customers and flyers to be able to get on board. They are doing some phenomenal compound complex agentic generative AI solutions in conjunction with traditional machine learning to be able to drive incremental value for customers and thus cost savings ultimately for the organization as well. So I think that was a great use case. We also have some good ones, I think, in manufacturing, like Rolls-Royce, doing some phenomenal work with a traditional AI around predictive maintenance on their engines. And so I think that for lots and lots of organizations, I am seeing them roll out AI solutions, whether it's what you would consider more traditional AI machine learning, or whether it's generative AI and agentic compound complex systems. I see both are actually starting to really happen at scale. Provided they've thought about some of those, where do they have the data ready that they can actually roll out these value outcomes. And the other thing is they really centered on what is the return on that investment, right? What is the business value that we're looking to drive? I think the organizations I see struggle the most are those that sort of said, oh, we just need to talk to our data. Let's set up a bunch of chat bots. Let's figure out what we're going to do with it. We'll figure it out later. Let's just get things rolled out. I think they're now taking a step back to say, how do we think about all of those investments? Are those things really driving as much incremental productivity, right? Incremental revenue, cost savings, whatever it is that we thought that we were going to drive? Are we really getting that out of some of the pilots? And if not, where do we de-invest so that we can reinvest in some of the other one, right? The other ones that would have bigger impact.
Yeah. And I think the way I have seen AI work effectively is to certainly be fast on experimentation, try things, and see what works. Of course, you're all working towards making sure there's business values being created. And one of the things you said, which is really good practical advice, is that don't wait for all your data to be in a perfect place. In fact, there's no such thing like that, right? But find where things are in a good place and get started. And so maybe give us a little bit of a double click into that. Like, how should an organization think about finding those opportunities and not waiting for perfection?
I have to admit, I don't know of any organization that is lacking in use cases that are coming from the business, right? I think for most organizations, we have thousands of use cases. Now, how do we look at it so that we can prioritize the ones that matter? And so I think, whereas like I talked about earlier, I think a few years ago, most organizations were focused just on the experimentation, doing things, trying things out, figuring out what works. I think most organizations today are taking a step back to say part of that prioritization framework is that we have to have a clear return on the investment. We have to have a clear business impact before we're going to start to test these. And so there's lots of factors that can go into that prioritization, but some of the best frameworks I have seen is, do you really understand what the investment is? Do you understand what the return on the investment and the business impact is going to be? And then, right, as you think about the governance and the fundamentals that we talked about earlier, how are you as an organization balancing risk versus innovation, right? Because I think traditionally we would have saw highly regulated organizations like healthcare, financial services, public sector, government, et cetera, tended to be risk averse. And so you would have thought that they would have been the slower ones to sort of adopt the new technology. And it's actually not what we're seeing. Financial services is probably one of the fastest moving industries that we see. Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase recently on stage with Databricks at our Data and AI Summit in June. And he talks about how critical AI has become to their day-to-day function at the C-level and within the organization, to the point where he actually has AI representation as part of his executive staff to make sure that they are thinking about how are they rethinking some of those legacy traditional processes and where can they leverage AI. But I think one of the things that JP Morgan did really well was think about where is that balance of what are the risk factors that really matter to the organization, where they needed to have absolute controls in place, versus where are there opportunities to innovate, because we were either doing things in a legacy way or the risk that it represents is less than what we thought it was, right? Yeah. So I think Organizations have said absolutely no experimentation with AI, which is where they were a couple of years ago. And then there were other organizations that said, do whatever you want. And I think for most organizations today, they're trying to figure out what is that balance. And so we have a great framework that's available up on the Databricks site. It's called the Databricks Security Framework, Databricks AI Security Framework. It was created by our field CISO and his team. And it's a phenomenal framework that you can take. It lists out the 62 risk factors. Before you panic, I promise all 62 won't apply to your organization. But it does give you like what are the risk factors we see across all industries. NIST and some others are using this as sort of a standard framework as well. So it's a great place, I think, to start to look at to say which of these risk factors we really care about within our organization. And then what are the controls for each of those risks that we can put in place to make sure that we're not exposing ourselves, our organizations, our patients, our clients, whatever it might be. How do we make sure that we're allowing the pace of innovation and yet we're protecting the things that matter to us as a company or as an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I love that there's the framework, because I've seen people like really worry about governance, and when governance becomes like the driver of everything, then it slows down the innovation. And that's, got to find the right balance, right? It's really important to get there. Yeah.
And I actually, for most organizations, I think it introduces incremental complexity because what will happen is you'll have pieces of the business that want to innovate faster. And like you just said, they feel like, right, whether it's legal or compliance or security or whoever it is precluding them from innovating at the pace that they want to. Often I say that's where these shadow platforms, shadow IT gets stood up because the business feels like they have a sufficient value proposition on the use cases that they want to roll out of production. So this is where I think when you can bring IT and legal and compliance and government affairs and security and the business all together to say, what are the risk factors that matter to us? And so how do we now create a prioritization framework for all those use cases based on the risks that we are willing, right? Which are the use cases that you can now actually proceed forward with because they're not a risk to the organization. And so sometimes giving that empowerment to the business. We talk about democratization of data and AI a lot. To me, that means empowering the business to be able to leverage the technology on their own without having to go back to a centralized team to sort of deliver, where that poor team then becomes overwhelmed and inundated with a backlog that they just can't keep up with.
Yeah, and I often think of this as democratization more as like collaboration. It's not just about like, hey, give me my data and let me go with it. It's like, how can different people and teams work together to that common goal? And I think that really brings us to one of the topics that I feel is really timely, which is AI literacy across the teams, right? And you mentioned legal, you mentioned business, there's engineering, and all of those different teams that are trying to work together. How should we think about the AI literacy and AI awareness across all of these?
Yeah, I think this is where I go back to maybe the commentary around every persona across your organization is going to have a different need when it comes to literacy, right? I think years ago when everybody approached it from the AI 101 or the data 101, we really did do one of two things. We either were too high and it was just for most organizations, it was a check the box type of activity that, yes, I sat through the AI literacy training or literacy training. I know what the word data means, right? Sort of. Or other organizations that immediately went super deep in the technology, expecting that everyone across the organization was ultimately going to be a data analyst or a data scientist in some capacity. And I am actually finding for most organizations, it is not those personas that have the right that we should be focused on only on as we think about data literacy. Like, yes, we need to help our data personas as the technology continues to move at the pace it does. But as you said, for democratization, it will vary depending on who the persona is. And so if you think about data and AI literacy, what does it mean for that person? What does it mean for that persona? So you could have an HR business partner or a finance business partner or a plant floor manufacturer or a store manager in retail or whatever it might be. But all of them will have a different necessity for what it means for them to be literate. What does it mean for them to be AI enabled? And so, as you think about your organization, my recommendation would be to look across the different domains, try to define as many of those personas as possible. And there might be overlap. For example, your HR business partner might be very similar to I know I'm just going to blank on some other back out, right? Some other back office business part, a program manager, right? That's a business program manager. Those personas might be very similar. And so if you think about starting to pull together your entire organization in these personas, not by people or organization or roles, but really by personas to say, what do we think is required for them if they were AI enabled as an organization or as a workforce? If we were going to enable them, what does that look like? What does that mean that we have an expectation? Does that mean they're going to work in Perplexity and Glean and write Power BI or Tableau or whatever the interface and tools are today? Does it mean we're going to leave them in that, but we expect them to do their processes or their job or their role differently? Then that's what the enablement for those personas should look like, if you think about it. It shouldn't be, let's put you into a Databricks notebook and make sure that we keep that
Yeah.
code in Python, right? It's just not going to be the same.
Yeah.
And so I think those that are doing it really well are starting to look across the organization to start to define those cohorts of personas, build out the enablement to say, if we were to say we were successful as a company or as an organization, that they are AI enabled, what do we think those outcomes look like? And so now how do we actually start to build the enablement that allows us to measure the maturity and competencies today versus where we aspirationally want them to be as a democratized AI capability? And now you can start to build it out. I think anybody that's looking just to pull this off the shelf someplace without thinking about what are the capabilities and competencies within their own organization will continue to struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious actually how things have changed maybe from your perspective, right? I mean, we were in a very analytics first world where I think for a lot of functions to understand data might have been a bit harder, but now in the AI world with a chat interface, I think data is at everybody's fingertips, or they're all benefiting from the data, right? So has that helped, like in terms of driving that awareness of data, that literacy of data and AI, and maybe people have developed more ease of understanding across different functions where prior maybe they were not thinking about data as much maybe a few years ago?
I don't know that it's I think more people are aware of it, right? Because it's almost become this expectation that you will have that information at your fingertips. I mean, I don't think there's probably a single listener that right now that hasn't thought about using ChatGPT to do something, right? Or Copilot or OpenAI, some capacity. I mean, I use ChatGPT almost on a daily basis, but it's things like I want to remodel my kitchen. Like if I change my kitchen cabinets to whatever color, right? Am I going to like it? But it has now become a given that I don't have to go into Adobe and build it out and do sort of all this graphics. I can just put it into ChatGPT, snap a picture, say change the color, and let's go. I think that same thing has translated into the enterprise, right? And so for most organizations, there is this expectation on how easy it is to find information, to process information, to make a decision. Where I see organizations continue to struggle is not the expectations that they will have data available at their fingertips in natural language or whatever interface they want. It's the how do we change our way of doing business as a result of that insight? Same problem we had, I think, in the data analytics days where data was accessible, even if you went into whatever dashboard or whichever of the 700 dashboards you had across the organization. It wasn't that data wasn't available. What the issue was is that we didn't help the organization figure out how to manage the transformation and the change management that it would take to do their job differently as a result of the data, right? And so how was it not just backward-looking reporting out of what happened in the business, but how was it actually now driving decisions in a different way or changing a process or impacting end-to-end supply chain or last mile delivery or whatever, right? Avoiding stockouts at a retailer. Like there's all sorts of value proposition, but it was always backward looking as opposed to being predictive and preventative. And I think we see the same thing with AI. Yes, there's this expectation that I will have this data and AI at my fingertips in whatever interface I want it in. Whatever tools that I am using now, I want to minimize that change. But now we have to help the organization think about, how does that now change how you do your function or your role, or how does it make you more productive, or how does it allow you to to be more productive, to solve that backlog of business problems that you've been trying to solve for, but you never had time because you were trying to rationalize 27 Excel spreadsheets to figure out what to order for your store for tomorrow. And
Oh, yeah.
that's what we need to help. Again, when I think about persona enablement, it is the translation to help those personas figure out, now that you have the power of all of this technology and all of this data and all of this AI at your fingertips, how do we help you figure out, what does that mean for you in your day-to-day function? What are the things that you no longer have to do, that you didn't like to do in the first place? How do we start to think about taking those things off? And my guidance for you is, if you're a part of the data science or data analytics team, you need to go sit with the domain. You need to sit with those business users, because all too often I find these centralized teams sort of build these solutions thinking that they understand what it looks like to be a day in the life of a line worker at an electric company, but you don't, until you sit in the truck with them and you drive from station to station and you're trying to do, manual verification of transformers. You don't understand what their life looks like. And so this is really where that business connectivity with technical capabilities, I think there's so much opportunity for IT teams to work together with the business to make sure that we're really figuring out what that looks like.
Yeah. I think it sort of asks for almost everybody to sort of become a little bit of a product manager, like spend time with your customer, understand what they're trying to do, and really bring that back into how you're solving that, right? One of the things is certainly happening that, of course, how we work is changing. It's changing the work culture. But I think one of the things I've heard from you is that you see different patterns across the organizations that you work with. And in your role, you work with many, right? Some will jump right into it. Some will do a lot of planning to get into that. What elements of organization culture sort of, play into that? And are there specific, sort of approaches you would recommend depending on what is that organizational culture?
Yeah, I think I have yet to see any organization that can just jump in, right? Unless maybe you're an organization of 3 people, where
Yeah.
it's just that you're right having a coffee and you figure out what that means. For most organizations, there's some level of complexity, there's some level of legacy, there's some a level of history or change, right? I think change is always the hardest part, right? Most people, I think we're all guilty of not sticking with a New Year's resolution past, February or whatever it is, because change is hard when you have to sort of change those behaviors. And so I think some of the best practices I see are, the education and enablement that we talked about. Like, how do we make sure that we're not creating the same expectation for everybody across the organization? And then once we know what that enablement is, how do we make sure that we're giving them the things that allow people to feel more comfortable with the technology? Because as fast as it's changing, we can't constantly change the tools that they're using, or the way that they're interacting. And so how do we make sure that we're maintaining where we can, right? That we're allowing like the same interface. For example, there's a great partner out there called Sigma that has like an Excel front end with a Databricks back end, right? Because we want access to that data in Excel. We don't want it to be stored localized, where people don't have the value proposition that data represents for the rest of the organization. And so start to think about, when you think about those personas, where are the tools? Where are they comfortable today? Where can you minimize the change while still modernizing and getting the data in a way that allows you to actually drive AI use cases on the other side? And so for lots and lots of organizations, I'm finding, if you can sort of minimize the change impact across the organization, the more successful, the more likely you are to be successful. I think the other thing is thinking about sort of a safe space to experiment. I think you referred earlier. I don't know of any organization that every data and AI use case that they've rolled out has been successful from the very beginning. So I think for many organizations where they've created a safe space, where the leadership doesn't have this expectation of 100% success rate for every use case or proof of concept or pilot that they're running across the organization. And so what is an acceptable level of failure, and how do you take the learnings from that failure to figure out what you'll do in the next use case, as as a data or AI product manager, how would you now roll that out across the organization differently to help the organization adopt the capability or the technology? Where is there the absolute, we need everybody in the organization to do some, right, to use or leverage some capability or competency that you're building across the organization? Now, how do you think about the processes and the frameworks that exist within the organization that you need to change to reinforce that behavior? How do you think about things like performance management across the organization, right? And so, if you want the entire organization to change and use data and AI differently, have you changed their KPIs and the expectations, how they perform in their role? And so, I think the organizations I see doing it really well is you've created that safe space for experimentation. You've thought about the impact that the actual pilots that you're going to roll out at production scale, what is that impact and change within the organization, whether it's a capability or a competency that you're going to build in that persona, or is it things like process, performance, metrics, anything that you need to change to help you reinforce that behavior. But I think that goes back to traditional change management, right?
Yeah.
That's been around for decades. And so I think oftentimes we think it's a magic bullet that's going to solve all these problems, but taking that step back to say, how do you create awareness or desire or knowledge and reward the right behaviors and continue to reinforce the capabilities and competencies that you view as successful for the organization? So my recommendation for that is figure out what has worked within your organization as you think about any big change that you have rolled out, whether it's a digital transformation, whether it's a technology transformation, whether it's a new executive leader. I mean, there's lots and lots of changes that organizations go through all the time. Look and see which are the ones that have been the most successful, and what were the things that within our organization, within our culture, resonated to help us to roll out that transformation in a way that we would say it was successful. And how do you replicate some of that as you think about data and AI transformation that you want to do going forward?
Yeah, I think the guide to future success, might lie in prior areas where you have seen that success and have seen what has worked in that on your organization, right? And I think talking of some of that part, I think one of the things has been like digital transformation, data transformation has been a big topic, and where are we on that? Like, has that become easier? Are there still like major roadblocks for people working through that? Or is that like just a continuous process that we have gotten used to now as we are building?
I think there are probably organizations out there that would say they absolutely haven't figured it all out yet, right? This is the interesting part, I think, about the pace of innovation that we see on the technology side, right? So if you think about it, in years past, when I first started at Microsoft, for example, the mission of the company was like a PC on every desktop.
Sure.
I remember one of the things that Satya Nadella did was change the mission, because by the time he came in, everybody had a PC, or PCs were obsolete, right? We had already sort of moved off to mobile devices, and there were other form factors that were being implemented when it came to technology. And so if you think about things like the internet, things like PC, things, even mobile devices, took years or decades to actually become norm and mainstream. The interesting part was, I think the pandemic was probably the first thing that really happened to us where we saw an instant need to transform as an organization in digital and data capabilities. And lots of organizations had to use that as a way to figure out, how are you going to change your operating models? How are you going to change your business models? How are you going to sort of transform the way that you interacted with customers or clients or patients or whatever it might be? How are your employees? How do you interact with your employees differently? Or how do you give them capabilities and competencies? So for me, that was interesting in that, unlike other transformations in the digital and data worlds that we had seen before that, where you had years to sort of take the organization, that was a great example of the resilience of your organization to do almost instantaneous transformation and change. I think I view generative AI and ChatGPT very similar in that, unlike most technologies that took a while to be adopted, it was one that was almost instantaneously available to everyone. And there was a almost instantaneous translation that lots of people within the organization saw as an opportunity to transform the way they did their job, the way that they could actually bring it into the enterprise. So unlike a PC where for most people, it was definitely something you potentially either did at work or you did at home, there was very little interaction between the two. This was something that was really transforming the way organizations. And so I think if organizations can think about how did you respond during the pandemic? How did you drive
Mhm.
your org through that change? And yes, it won't be as painful. We're not going to put you in quarantine or make you wear masks all the time. But how do we think about some of the things that really worked as we were responding in real time to what was happening? I would view this transformation as very similar. We're responding in real time to the capabilities of the technology. And that doesn't mean that we will automatically change everything about the organization, but it does
Yeah.
mean that it's a great opportunity for us to take a step back to say, what are the things that we can change or should change as a result of the capabilities and technical capabilities that exist today that didn't exist 10 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, you work with many organizations of different sizes and different industries, and you're coming in as a CDO. Many of them may or may not have a CDO, but you're coming in as an outside expert. Do you have some quick recipes for people, like see some early success in 30 days or 60 days that you might want to suggest? Like, you've given quite a few of those, but is there one or two things you would say, do this and you'll see some, you know, success
Yeah, I think
quickly?
it's
Yeah.
what we Yeah, I think it's what we talked about earlier. Like, how do you focus on that quick win, right? Like, you will never have your entire data platform. You will never have all of the data across your organization in a clean, pristine state. And so I think if you are sitting back to wait until you have everything aligned and everything ready and everyone in the organization bought into the change and the transformation, I think you will wait forever. And so, absolutely, my recommendation for those organizations that I see of any size do this really well is they are focused on of all these use cases that we've received from the organization or from the business, which are the ones that we can actually deliver against today, which ones where we have the data ready, where we have the right governance in place, we have the right operating model and agreement on how it's going to work. We have the right enablement plan in place for the actual users of the solution to be able to move forward, et cetera. Where are some of those quick wins that you can really sort of deliver? And again, I will go back to sort of the commentary around the maturity of the organization. I have seen organizations take the most mature parts of their business and focus on those use cases because the lift to get them enabled and
Mhm.
actually change and transform is relatively light, especially if it's a complex use case. If you're talking about a simple use case and you have a less mature part of the business that you're trying to take on the journey, but the tool or the interface is natural language or something that makes it easier, and you want to use that as a quick win to start to get the rest of the organization bought into why the transformation. So again, I think it's sort of a case by case basis and thinking about where's the maturity of your organization by domain and by persona, and then what is the aspiration when you look across the organization. And I think you need to know both of those pieces before you just sort of decide which use case is going to be the most impactful. Otherwise, it's really easy to just tackle one use case after the other, but it's not always the right ones for the
Yeah.
business. And
Yeah.
so how do you start to think about where you are today, where you want to be in the future, and then how do you start to now prioritize some of those use cases based on the fundamentals and foundations that are in place that you could actually deliver?
Yeah, yeah, and you definitely touch earlier upon the importance of sort of looking at the ROI and understanding them and measuring that, right? And I think one of the great things you noted was in organizations like JP Morgan, where you mentioned it's coming from the CEO, and I think that has a huge impact in sort of driving change across that organization and bringing momentum to that, right? Before we wrap up, I was wondering if you might have some pointers for folks in terms of places they should look at for learning and getting better at understanding the organizational aspects of data and being able to move faster with change. And you shared a couple of case studies, but anything you might want to point us to?
Yeah, I think I think there's always lessons learned from the past, right?
Yeah.
And so I think for me, there's a couple of right. If you think about traditional change management, there's some great courses out there. You can either go back, you can do it as a certification program. Lots of places there are lots of great programs around just traditional change management, and I think for anyone that is looking to drive that change, I think understanding those fundamentals of how do you drive change or transformation. There's some great Harvard Business Review case studies that exist out there on successes and failures. I think Microsoft has one out there that's really actually a decent read. I also find things like I listen to the Acquired podcast.
Mhm.
Talks about acquisitions that have happened across the ecosystem and the change that was required as you think about things like merger and acquisitions are huge transformations for organizations. And so I'm always fascinated to listen to some of those stories on which acquisitions went well or didn't go well, and can I translate them back into an organizational change management sort of failure or success. And so think about where you can learn from the past of where we have tried or seen organizations try to change and transform over time and what has worked for them, because sometimes it gives you an idea of, especially if you can compare to an organization that's similar to yours in either size or scope or industry or clients, geography, et cetera. There's lots of ways that you can sort of look at it. Can you look at what you would view as successful acquisitions that have happened in your space and do some comparison on what worked or what didn't as you think about building out that muscle and capability within your own organization?
Well, thank you. Now, that's a great piece of advice. And finally, you've been very active in giving back to the community, as a mentor to data and AI professionals. And, in particular, you have done a lot of work empowering women leaders in data. Anything you want to share with the audience and how they can be thinking more actively and about giving back and contributing?
Yeah, I would say data and AI is a small world. So I think anywhere where you can help build the community, what I really enjoy about the participation in the community is how do we make it better for the next generation of talent that's coming in, right? I want them to learn it on their own and make their own mistakes and not just have to repeat all the many mistakes that I have made throughout my career. And so I think there's sort of two benefits. One is how do you help the next generation grow and develop and go even further than we've been able to do in our lifetimes. And then again, it's a super small world. And so anywhere where you can actually drive value, share best practices, talk to somebody else who's going through the same pains that you are. So figure out the communities that exist across your organization. I highly recommend finding a community that includes people from outside your company. Oftentimes we get so caught up in work and the day-to-day job, and everybody has that same viewpoint because you're all within the same organization. So anywhere where you can connect with an outside community, whether it's a Databricks user group that's within your city, or is it the Women in Data, right, that exists, or a Women in Tech, or I'm sure there's lots and lots of them. They're geared around technology or role or function or whatever that might be. So find one or two communities where you really can sort of connect with, because you will find that you will stay connected with those people throughout your career as you all sort of move between organizations and deliver more and more successes. And hopefully we can all lift each other up across the data and AI community that way.
Awesome. That's a great message to wrap this up with. It's been an incredible conversation, chatting with you, learning from you. And, before we wrap up, if folks want to follow along with your work, what's the best place for them follow your work?
Yeah, LinkedIn is
Okay.
probably the best place. So
Okay.
feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. And if there's something that resonated, or if you want to have a conversation, if you don't agree with me, I would love to have that discussion as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I love controversial conversations. We learn a lot when we do that, actually. So,
Absolutely.
well, thank you so much for joining us today, Robin.
Thank you.